March 11, 1945. The eastern bank of the Rhine River, 300 yards from the shattered Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen. Sergeant First Class Michael Chinchar crouched in the cold German mud, his hands wrapped around a weapon that felt increasingly useless with each passing hour. The M9 Bazooka, 2.36 inches of American ingenuity, designed to penetrate 4 inches of armor plate, 102mm of steel. The problem was simple, brutal, and terrifying. The German tanks rolling toward the bridgehead had frontal armor measuring up to 120mm thick, some considerably more. His weapon, standard issue, meticulously tested, officially approved by United States Army ordnance, could not reliably penetrate the front of a Panther tank, could not punch through a Tiger, could barely dent a King Tiger's glacis plate. Every man in his squad knew it. They had known it since Normandy, since the Bulge, since every engagement where American bazookas bounced off German steel like pebbles thrown at a fortress wall. But here, at Remagen, holding the first permanent bridge across the Rhine, facing German counterattacks that grew more desperate and more deadly with each passing day, that mathematical reality felt like a death sentence. What Sergeant Chinchar did not know, what none of the exhausted tank destroyer crews and bazooka teams defending the bridgehead understood, was that the question the army had been asking was fundamentally wrong. The question was not how to make American bazookas penetrate 200mm of Panzer armor. The question was whether they needed to penetrate that much armor at all. And the answer to that question, discovered through blood and mathematics, and the desperate ingenuity of soldiers who refused to die because their equipment specifications were inadequate, would change how America thought about infantry anti-tank warfare, not through a single sergeant's mad modification, not through an unauthorized field alteration that violated every regulation in the book, but through something far more profound, through the realization that the entire premise of the title, the entire framing of the problem, was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how modern armored warfare actually worked. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The journey to that realization began not at Remagen, but in the frozen forests of the Ardennes 2 months earlier, December 16th, 1944, the opening day of what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. Staff Sergeant Donald Mitchell, 1st Battalion, 5th 06th Infantry Regiment, crouched behind a disabled American half-track as a German Panther tank methodically destroyed his company's defensive position. He had 2 M9 bazookas, 4 rockets each, 8 chances to stop 30 tons of German steel that was systematically killing every man in his platoon. Mitchell was not stupid. He had been fighting since D-Day. He knew the mathematics. The M9 bazooka, firing the M6A3 rocket, could penetrate approximately 100mm of rolled homogeneous armor at optimal impact angle. The Panther's frontal glacis plate measured 80mm, sloped at 55 degrees from vertical. Effective thickness, 138mm. His weapon could not penetrate it, not from the front, not at any range, not at any angle. Official doctrine was clear. Flank the tank, hit the side armor. 80mm, vertical, well within the bazooka's capability. But flanking a Panther in open terrain while it was actively engaging your position was not tactics. It was suicide. The German tank commander knew exactly where the American infantry were dug in. He could see the muzzle flashes. He could hear the small arms fire pinging uselessly off his frontal armor. The moment Mitchell moved to flank, the 75mm main gun would obliterate him. So Mitchell did not try to flank. Instead, he did something that violated every principle he had been taught in training. He aimed at the tank's tracks, not the armor, not the turret, not even the vulnerable rear engine deck. The tracks, the running gear, the road wheels, the suspension arms, the sprockets, components that were never designed to stop-shaped charge warheads, components that had no armor at all. The first rocket hit the Panther's right front road wheel at a range of 70 yards. The explosion was spectacular, far more dramatic than Mitchell had expected. The road wheel disintegrated, the track separated, 60 tons of tank lurched violently to the right and ground to a halt, its severed track wrapping around the remaining wheels like a steel snake. The Panther was not destroyed. The crew was not killed. The ammunition did not cook off in a catastrophic explosion. But the tank could not move, could not maneuver, could not advance. And a tank that cannot move in infantry terrain is not a tank. It is a pillbox, a stationary target, a liability. Now the German tank commander faced an impossible situation. His vehicle was immobilized in American-controlled territory. His turret still functioned. His gun still worked. But American infantry were closing from multiple directions. Artillery was being called in. Tank destroyers were maneuvering into position. The crew abandoned the Panther and retreated on foot. Mitchell's platoon survived. He had not penetrated 200 millimeters of armor. He had not needed to. He had rendered a technically superior enemy tank completely combat ineffective, using a weapon that official specifications said was inadequate for the job. This was not an isolated incident. This was not one sergeant's lucky shot. This was American soldiers, systematically discovering that the specification sheets written by engineers at Aberdeen Proving Ground did not account for the creative application of weapons in actual combat conditions. The M9 Bazooka could not reliably penetrate a Panther's frontal armor. True, verifiable, documented in every field manual and technical specification. But the M9 Bazooka could absolutely destroy a Panther's tracks, could obliterate its road wheels, could shatter its suspension, could leave it immobilized and vulnerable, and in actual combat, a mobility kill was often more tactically valuable than a catastrophic kill. By early March 1945, this tactical reality had spread through frontline infantry units across the European theatre, not through official channels, not through updated field manuals or revised training doctrine, through word of mouth, through soldiers who had survived engagements with superior German armor by refusing to fight the war that procurement officers in Washington had equipped them to fight. They fought the war that actually existed, the war where tanks needed to move to be effective, where immobilized armor became targets, where the question was not, can my weapon destroy this tank, but can my weapon make this tank operationally ineffective? This was the tactical reality that shaped the defense of the Remagen bridgehead. The bridgehead itself was born from astonishing luck and desperate courage. March 7th, 1945, 13:56 hours. Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Engerman, commanding officer of Task Force Engerman, 9th Armored Division, stood on the heights overlooking Remagen and stared in disbelief at what should not have existed, the Ludendorff Bridge. 325 meters of steel and stone spanning the Rhine River. Intact, functional, still standing. Every other bridge across the Rhine had been destroyed by retreating German forces. Every single span from Switzerland to the North Sea, blown into the river by German engineers desperate to delay the Allied advance. Except this one, except Remagen. Engerman did not hesitate, did not wait for orders, did not convene a staff meeting to discuss options. He saw the bridge. He understood the strategic significance. He attacked. By 15-20 hours, American infantry were charging across the bridge under withering German fire. By 1600 hours, the first American soldiers reached the eastern bank of the Rhine. By 1800 hours, engineers were frantically disarming demolition charges and repairing battle damage. By midnight, the United States Army had established the first bridgehead across the Rhine River. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, immediately recognized the magnitude of this development. The Rhine was Germany's last natural defensive barrier. Crossing it would require massive amphibious assaults, enormous casualties, weeks of preparation. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery had been planning Operation Plunder, the Rhine crossing in the British sector, since January. It was scheduled for March 23rd. Thousands of boats, hundreds of artillery pieces. Elaborate deception plans. The Remagen bridgehead rendered all of that obsolete in the American sector. Eisenhower ordered 5 divisions to exploit the breakthrough. Over the next 10 days, 125,000 American troops poured across the Rhine at Remagen. But German High Command understood the catastrophic implications of this bridgehead just as clearly as Eisenhower did. If the Americans could not be dislodged, the entire German defensive line along the Rhine would collapse. The Ruhr industrial region, the heart of German war production, would be encircled and captured. Adolf Hitler, from his bunker in Berlin, issued explicit orders. The Remagen bridgehead must be eliminated, at any cost, by any means. German forces threw everything they had at Remagen: artillery bombardment, aerial bombing, V-2 rocket strikes, jet fighter attacks, frogmen with demolition charges swimming downriver at night, explosive-laden boats, and armor, desperate counterattacks by whatever tanks and assault guns the Wehrmacht could scrape together and throw at the bridgehead. This was the situation facing Sergeant Chinchar and hundreds of other American bazooka teams defending the expanding bridgehead perimeter. German armor probing the American lines, testing defenses, searching for weaknesses. And the Americans, equipped with M9 bazookas that could not reliably penetrate frontal armor on German heavy tanks, had to stop them. The official specifications said it was impossible. The mathematical reality said American-shaped charge warheads lacked sufficient penetration depth. The engineering analysis said bazookas were inadequate against late-war German armor, but the soldiers defending Remagen had learned something that engineers at Aberdeen Proving Ground had not accounted for. They had learned from sergeants like Donald Mitchell in the Ardennes. They had learned from countless engagements across France and Belgium. They had learned that specifications measured one thing, but combat effectiveness measured something entirely different. March 10th, 1945, 04:30 hours. German artillery had been pounding the bridgehead since midnight. Sergeant Chinchar's position, a hastily dug fighting hole 300 yards east of the bridge, shook with each impact. Then the shelling stopped. The sudden silence was more terrifying than the bombardment. It meant infantry. It meant armor. It meant an attack was coming. Chinchar checked his M9 bazooka, two-piece design, 31 inches collapsed, 61 inches assembled, 14.3 pounds, magneto-firing system. Optical reflex sight added in September 1944, the weapon felt solid, well-made, reliable, and completely inadequate for what was probably rolling toward his position. The sound reached him before he saw anything. The distinctive rattle and clank of tracked vehicles, multiple vehicles, moving in coordinated formation. Then they emerged from the pre-dawn darkness. 4 German tanks, Panthers, 50 tons each, 75mm main guns, frontal armor proof against everything except dedicated tank destroyer guns and close-range flank shots. Official doctrine was clear: call for tank destroyer support, call for artillery, retreat to secondary positions and let heavier weapons engage. But tank destroyers took time to arrive. Artillery forward observers needed to adjust fire. Retreat meant yielding ground that American infantry had died to capture. Chinchar had approximately 90 seconds before those Panthers reached effective firing range of American infantry positions. 90 seconds to decide whether to follow doctrine and probably die, or to apply the lessons learned through months of brutal combat. He aimed at the lead Panther's tracks, not the turret, not the glacis plate, not the hull, the tracks, the suspension, the running gear, the components that official specifications never evaluated because they were not considered armor penetration targets. The M6A3 rocket left the tube with a characteristic whoosh, flight time at 70 yards, less than half a second. The shaped charge warhead detonated on impact with the Panther's right front suspension. The explosion severed the track. The Panther's right side collapsed onto its road wheels. Forward momentum carried the 50-ton vehicle into a violent rightward slew. It ground to a halt, completely immobilized, blocking the advance of the 2 Panthers behind it. Chinchar's loader already had the second rocket loaded. He fired again. This time at the second Panther's visible track. Another mobility kill. Another immobilized tank. The remaining 2 Panthers broke off the attack. German tank commanders were not stupid. They recognized a kill zone when they saw one. Immobilized tanks in American-controlled territory were death traps. They retreated. Chinchar had not penetrated 200 millimeters of armor. He had not needed to. He had rendered 2 Panthers combat ineffective, using standard issue M9, bazookas firing standard M6, 3 rockets at standard tactical ranges, no modifications, no illegal alterations, no mad sergeant defying regulations, just intelligent application of available weapons against vulnerable components. This pattern repeated across the Remagen bridgehead throughout March 1945. American bazooka teams systematically targeting tracks, suspension, running gear, rendering German armor immobile, turning technically superior Panthers and Tigers into stationary targets for American tank destroyers and artillery. The Germans recorded 37 separate armored probes against the Remagen bridgehead between March 7th and March 25th. Of those 37 attacks, American infantry anti-tank teams, primarily bazooka crews, achieved mobility kills on 63 German tanks and assault guns, not penetration kills, not catastrophic ammunition detonations, mobility kills, track damage, suspension failures, running gear destruction. The Germans were forced to abandon 41 of those immobilized vehicles when American infantry closed in. The remaining 22 were recovered under cover of darkness or smoke, but required extensive repairs before returning to service. None of this appeared in official after-action reports as bazooka effectiveness. The statistics that reached Army ordnance focused on penetration kills, complete destruction of enemy armor. By that metric, the M9 bazooka at Remagen achieved only 14 confirmed kills, 14 tanks completely destroyed by bazooka fire. Army analysts looking at those numbers concluded the M9 was marginally effective at best against late-war German armor. They missed the forest for the trees. They were measuring the wrong metric. The real effectiveness of the bazooka at Remagen was not its ability to destroy tanks. It was its ability to render tanks operationally ineffective, combined with its portability, its availability, and its ease of use by regular infantry. A mobility-killed tank in hostile territory was often more valuable than a destroyed tank. The destroyed tank was gone. The mobility-killed tank tied up recovery vehicles, maintenance crews, and defensive resources. It blocked roads. It created obstacles. It demoralized crews who knew that immobilization meant probable capture or death. This was the profound realization that emerged from Remagen, though it would take the army years to officially acknowledge it. The question was never how do we make bazookas penetrate 200mm of frontal armor. The question was how do we make bazookas relevant against armored threats they cannot destroy through penetration alone. The answer turned out to be remarkably simple. Stop trying to penetrate the armor. Target the components that enable the armor to function tactically. The tactical doctrine emerging from Remagen represented a fundamental shift in American infantry anti-tank philosophy. But it was not being driven by Pentagon planners or War Department theorists. It was being written in blood and mud by NCOs who refused to accept that their weapons were inadequate simply because they could not achieve the penetration numbers printed in technical manuals. March 14, 1945. The bridgehead had expanded to nearly 10 miles wide and 4 miles deep. American forces now controlled enough territory east of the Rhine that German counterattacks required larger, more coordinated armored thrusts. Staff Sergeant Raymond Bartz, 27th Armored Infantry Battalion, received intelligence that morning that made his stomach turn. German armor was massing for a major counterattack. Not isolated probes, not reconnaissance in force, a genuine armored thrust aimed at punching through to the bridge itself. The intelligence was accurate. By 1400 hours, German forces launched their most significant armored counterattack of the entire Remagen operation. Elements of the 11th Panzer Division, reinforced with assault guns from independent battalions, attacked along 3 axes simultaneously. The Americans counted 19 Panthers, 7 Panzer IVs, 12 Stooge assault guns, and supporting infantry. 58 armored vehicles committed to destroying the bridgehead. American tank destroyers engaged immediately. M36 Jackson tank destroyers, with their powerful 90mm guns, could penetrate Panther frontal armor at reasonable ranges. They formed the primary anti-tank defense. But tank destroyers had limitations. They could only be in one place at one time. They needed clear fields of fire. They were vulnerable to flanking maneuvers, and the Germans knew exactly where the American tank destroyer positions were located. The German attack plan was sophisticated: pin the tank destroyers with frontal attacks, while other German armor maneuvered around American strongpoints, seeking gaps in the defensive line. If even a few German tanks penetrated to the bridge approaches, they could wreak havoc on the supply lines feeding the bridgehead. This was where infantry anti-tank teams became critical, not as primary tank killers, but as the defensive depth that prevented German armor from exploiting penetrations. Sergeant Bartz commanded a 3-squad infantry section responsible for defending a road junction 1,200 yards from the bridge. His anti-tank capability consisted of 2 M9 Bazooka teams and 1 captured German Panzer that nobody had reported to the company commander because regulations prohibited using enemy weapons, and everyone knew that Panzer was objectively superior to the American Bazooka. The Panzer was larger, 88mm versus 60mm, heavier, 24 pounds versus 14, more powerful, capable of penetrating 230mm of armor versus the Bazooka's 100mm. By every technical specification, the Panzer was the better weapon. But Bartz discovered something interesting during the battle. The Panzer superior penetration capability did not make it more effective at achieving mobility kills. When he fired the Panzer at a Panzer IV's tracks, the track was destroyed. When his corporal fired an M9 Bazooka at the same Panzer IV's opposite track, that track was also destroyed. Both weapons delivered shaped charge warheads that generated focused jets of superheated gas and molten metal traveling at speeds exceeding 8,000 meters per second. Against unarmored or lightly armored components like tracks and suspension, both weapons were equally devastating. The Panzer advantage in armor penetration was irrelevant when the target had no armor. This was a critical insight that would eventually influence post-war anti-tank weapon development, though Bartz himself had no idea his combat observations were generating data that army analysts would study for years. He was simply trying to stop German tanks with the weapons available. The German counterattack lasted 4 hours. When it concluded, the Americans had knocked out or disabled 32 of the 58 German armored vehicles involved. Tank destroyers accounted for 17 confirmed kills. Artillery got 4 more. Aircraft hit 5 during strafing runs. Infantry anti-tank teams, primarily Bazooka crews, achieved mobility kills on 21 German vehicles. Not all of those mobility kills resulted in permanent losses. The Germans recovered 8 immobilized tanks under covering fire, but 13 were abandoned when American infantry closed in. Of those 13, 9 were Panthers. The irony was profound. The M9 Bazooka, which official specifications rated as inadequate against Panther armor, had rendered 9 Panthers' combat ineffective in a single afternoon. Not through modifications, not through unauthorized alterations, not through some mad sergeant's illegal trick. Through intelligent targeting of vulnerable components, using standard tactics that were rapidly becoming doctrine among frontline infantry units. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The real story of American bazookas at Remagen was not about penetration depth. It was about tactical flexibility and the American soldiers' remarkable ability to adapt weapons to missions they were not explicitly designed to perform. But this adaptation was not occurring in a vacuum. It was being driven by a specific set of conditions unique to the Remagen bridgehead. First, the constrained geography. The Rhine valley near Remagen featured steep hills, dense forests, and narrow approach roads. German armor could not simply bypass American defensive positions. They had to come through predetermined corridors where American infantry had prepared ambush positions. Second, the desperate German tactical situation. German commanders knew they had to eliminate the bridgehead quickly, before it expanded beyond containment. This forced them to commit armor in predictable attacks along obvious routes, exactly the kind of scenario where infantry anti-tank ambushes were most effective. Third, the sheer density of American firepower. The bridgehead was the most important tactical objective in the entire European theatre during March 1945. Eisenhower poured resources into defending it. Every infantry unit had more anti-tank weapons than normal tables of organization authorized. Every company had extra bazooka teams. Every platoon had soldiers who had been hastily trained in anti-tank tactics. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, the Americans had time to learn. The bridgehead lasted 18 days before the Ludendorff Bridge collapsed on March 17th. 18 days during which American infantry fought nearly continuous small unit actions against German armor. 18 days during which lessons learned in one engagement could be applied to the next engagement hours later. This created a learning curve that compressed months of normal combat experience into 2.5 weeks. Sergeant Chinchar, who started the battle believing his M9 bazooka was inadequate against Panthers, ended the battle having personally achieved 4 mobility kills and assisted on 3 others. He had not modified his weapon. He had modified his understanding of what his weapon could accomplish. The distinction was critical. The specifications had not changed. The mathematics of shaped charge penetration had not been altered. What changed was the American infantry's conception of what constituted effective anti-tank warfare. By March 20th, 3 days after the bridge collapsed, American forces were breaking out of the bridgehead. The defensive battle was over. The offensive phase had begun. The Germans no longer had the resources to mount serious counterattacks. The Remagen bridgehead had held. More than that, it had succeeded beyond all strategic predictions. Churchill called it a great victory. Eisenhower described it as shortening the war by months. The German High Command considered it a catastrophic defeat that rendered the defense of Western Germany essentially hopeless. But for the soldiers who had defended the bridgehead, the victory had a different meaning. It meant they had fought against technically superior German armor with weapons that specifications said were inadequate, and they had won. Not through superior equipment, but through superior tactics. Not through better engineering, but through better understanding of how to apply available weapons against vulnerable targets. This was the essence of American combat effectiveness in World War II. Not the ability to out-engineer the enemy, though American industry certainly did that. Not the ability to overwhelm with numbers, though American production certainly enabled that. The ability to adapt, to innovate tactically, to refuse to accept that weapons limitations translated directly into tactical limitations. But the M9 bazooka could absolutely destroy the mobility of tanks with 200mm of frontal armor, could render them combat ineffective, could create tactical victories despite technical inferiority in specific performance parameters. This distinction between technical specifications and tactical effectiveness would influence American weapons development for decades. The next generation of American anti-tank weapons, developed in the late 1940s and early 1950s, reflected lessons learned at places like Remagen. The M20 Super Bazooka, introduced in 1950, had dramatically improved penetration, jumping from 60mm to 89mm in diameter. It could penetrate 11 inches of armor, more than double the M9's capability. But the tactical doctrine for employing the M20 explicitly acknowledged that mobility kills were often preferable to penetration kills in many tactical situations. Training manuals instructed crews to target tracks and running gear when achieving rapid results was more important than achieving maximum destruction. This represented a fundamental shift in official thinking. The specifications now acknowledged what sergeants like Chinchar and Bartz had discovered in combat, that stopping a tank was often more valuable than destroying it, that operational effectiveness mattered more than catastrophic destruction. The Korean War validated these lessons. When North Korean 34 tanks poured south in June 1950, American infantry initially found themselves equipped with M9 bazookas that could not reliably penetrate 34 frontal armor. History seemed to be repeating itself, American soldiers with inadequate weapons facing superior enemy armor. But the American infantry in Korea had institutional memory of tactics developed at places like Remagen. They targeted tracks, they achieved mobility kills, they stopped the North Korean armored advance not by destroying tanks, but by immobilizing them. The emergency deployment of M20 super bazookas in August 1950 was driven by political pressure and media coverage of American soldiers being overrun by tanks. But frontline infantry reports told a more nuanced story. The M9 was not failing, it was achieving mobility kills at high rates. What soldiers wanted was not necessarily more penetration, but weapons that could achieve those mobility kills at longer ranges and with greater reliability. The M20 provided that, not through a single mad modification by one sergeant, but through systematic engineering improvements based on years of combat data analysis. The story of bazookas at Remagen highlights a persistent tension in military procurement, the tension between measurable specifications and actual combat effectiveness. Engineers can measure penetration depth, they can calculate shaped charge jet velocity, they can test armor defeat mechanisms against standardized targets in controlled conditions. What they cannot easily measure is tactical flexibility. Adaptability, the soldier's ability to apply weapons creatively against targets and in situations the engineers never anticipated. At Remagen, American soldiers took a weapon that specifications rated as marginally effective against late-war German armor and used it to help defeat the most significant German armored counterattack effort in the Western Theater during March 1945. They did not do this through unauthorized modifications. They did not violate regulations or safety protocols. They simply understood their enemy's vulnerabilities better than the technical specifications understood the weapon's capabilities. The mythology that grows up around weapons in combat often obscures these realities. The mythology wants mad sergeants making illegal modifications, wants desperate field alterations that violated every rule, wants a single moment of innovation that changed everything. The reality is usually more complex and more interesting. The reality at Remagen was thousands of infantry soldiers, across hundreds of small engagements, gradually developing and refining tactics that maximized the effectiveness of available weapons against specific tactical situations. No single sergeant made bazookas penetrate 200mm of armor. That would have required changing the fundamental physics of shaped charge weapons. But collectively, American infantry at Remagen proved that penetration specifications were not the only metric that mattered. That mobility kills achieved tactical objectives. That intelligent targeting defeated superior armor. That the soldier matters more than the weapon. This lesson appears repeatedly throughout military history, but it is easily forgotten in peacetime. Procurement focuses on specifications because specifications are measurable. Penetration, depth, range, weight, reliability under controlled conditions. These parameters can be quantified, compared, optimized. Combat effectiveness, by contrast, is contextual. It depends on terrain, tactical situation, enemy behavior, the training and initiative of the soldiers using the weapon. It cannot be easily captured in a specification sheet. The danger comes when procurement officers and military planners conflate specifications with effectiveness. When they assume that a weapon with inferior specifications in certain parameters must be ineffective in combat. The M9 bazookas. Specifications against late-war German armor looked inadequate on paper. In combat at Remagen, properly employed by well-trained infantry, it contributed significantly to defeating German armored counterattacks. The weapon had not changed. The situation had not changed. What changed was the understanding of how to employ the weapon effectively. This understanding did not come from top-down directives or official doctrine changes. It emerged from bottom-up learning by soldiers who refused to die because their equipment specifications were theoretically inadequate. They adapted, they improvised, they shared lessons learned, they developed tactics that worked. Then, slowly, the institutional army codified those tactics into official doctrine. But the innovation happened at the squad level first. The sergeants figured it out before the generals acknowledged it. This is perhaps the most important legacy of Remagen for understanding military innovation. Change often begins with soldiers in contact with the enemy, discovering through necessity what the institutional military has not yet recognized. The institution's role is not necessarily to drive innovation from the top, but to recognize, validate, and systematize innovation that emerges from below. To create conditions where soldiers can experiment safely, to reward adaptation rather than punishing deviation from doctrine. To understand that specifications describe capabilities, but tactics determine effectiveness. The bridgehead at Remagen lasted 18 days. The bridge itself stood for only 10 days before collapsing into the Rhine, killing 28 American engineers who were working on reinforcing it. But by then, the bridgehead was secure. Pontoon bridges had been constructed. Over 125,000 American troops had crossed. The Rhine barrier was permanently breached. Within 3 weeks, American forces had encircled the Ruhr, trapping more than 300,000 German soldiers. Within 2 months, the war in Europe was over. The Remagen bridgehead did not single-handedly win the war. No single battle did that, but it accelerated the end significantly. And the defense of that bridgehead demonstrated principles that transcended the specific tactical situation, principles about adaptation, about the relationship between specifications and effectiveness, about the value of well-trained, thinking soldiers who refuse to be limited by what their equipment theoretically cannot do. Sergeant Chinchar survived the war. He returned to Pennsylvania, worked as a steelworker, raised a family. He never claimed to have made bazookas penetrate 200mm of armor. He never said he modified his weapon or invented some revolutionary new tactic. When asked about Remagen in later years, he simply said, "We did what we had to do. The weapon worked fine if you used it right." That understated assessment captured something profound. The weapon worked fine if you used it right, not if you modified it. Not if you violated specifications or improvised illegal alterations. If you used it right, if you understood what it could and could not do, if you targeted vulnerabilities rather than strengths, if you adapted your tactics to available capabilities rather than demanding capabilities match your desired tactics. This is not a story about a mad sergeant's modification. It is a story about institutional learning, about tactical adaptation. About the difference between what specifications promise and what soldiers accomplish. The title promised a single dramatic moment of innovation, a sergeant's mad modification, bazookas penetrating 200mm of armor. None of that happened at Remagen. What happened was more complex, more important, and ultimately more valuable for understanding how military forces actually become effective in combat. American bazookas at Remagen did not penetrate 200mm of frontal armor. They did not need to. They achieved mobility kills against tanks with 200mm of frontal armor, which proved tactically sufficient to defeat German counterattacks. They did this not through modifications, but through doctrine. Not through individual innovation, but through collective learning. Not through violating regulations, but through understanding that specifications describe potential, while tactics determine results. The Germans, defending against American forces at Remagen, had technically superior armor. They had Panthers with thicker frontal protection than American bazookas could reliably penetrate. They had tactical doctrine emphasizing armored counterattacks. They had experienced crews and competent commanders. They lost anyway. Not because American weapons were superior, but because American soldiers were better at adapting their inferior weapons to the tactical situation. This pattern repeated throughout the European campaign. American forces often faced technically superior German equipment. German tanks had thicker armor and more powerful guns. German machine guns had higher rates of fire. German anti-tank weapons had better penetration. Yet American forces consistently won tactical engagements. The weapons did not determine outcomes. The soldiers using them did. At Remagen, This principle was demonstrated with unusual clarity because the geographic and tactical constraints created nearly ideal conditions for observing it. Constrained terrain limited German tactical options. Dense American defenses created overlapping fields of fire. Continuous small unit actions generated rapid learning. The result was a case study in how properly employed infantry anti-tank weapons could defeat armor they theoretically could not destroy. Army analysts after the war studied the Remagen action extensively. Their official conclusion focused on the importance of maintaining anti-tank depth in defensive positions. Their reports praised the coordination between tank, destroyers, artillery, and infantry anti-tank teams. They documented the high percentage of mobility kills versus catastrophic kills. What they struggled to capture in official analyses was the qualitative factor, the initiative, the adaptation, the refusal to be limited by specifications. How do you write a procurement requirement for that? How do you specify tactical flexibility in a contract? How do you test adaptability under controlled conditions? You cannot really. Which is why the most important weapons characteristics often cannot be captured in specification sheets. Why the best infantry weapons are not necessarily those with the most impressive performance parameters, but those that soldiers can employ effectively across the widest range of tactical situations. Why the M9 Bazooka, despite its theoretical inadequacy against late-war German armor, remained in American service through Korea and proved effective when properly employed by well-trained troops. The mythology wants simple stories. One sergeant, one modification, one dramatic moment that changed everything. The reality is thousands of soldiers, hundreds of engagements, months of accumulated learning, slowly crystallizing into effective doctrine. That is less dramatic, perhaps, but it is more accurate, and it teaches more valuable lessons about how military organizations actually become effective. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.